Hello, guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Skills and Abilities. Today we have Mr. Dusty Bones with us. He's a little sleepy today, it seems like. He's a little tired. That's okay. He can sleep here with me. Today we're going to be going over another one of the Fire Druid abilities. Yesterday we covered Firestorm, or last episode, rather. Today we're going to be covering Molten Boulder. So Molten Boulder is a rather odd one because it's not just fire damage, like Fissure or Firestorm, which are both only fire damage. Molten Boulder has many different aspects, actually, to it, including explosions, fire damage, and believe it or not, actually Meteor's fire damage. It's actually the same exact fire damage that Meteor has. So how does Molten Boulder work, and is it a good ability? Let's go over it together. So first off, Molten Boulder has a 1 second casting delay. As you can clearly see, I cannot cast it more than every 1 second, plus my current casting delay. So the way that delayed abilities work is that the casting delay is equivalent to the number of frames that it would take for that casting delay to have effect. So 1 second is equivalent to 25 frames, and my casting speed might be, say, let's say 7 frames. And if I'm running a 7-frame casting speed on my Druid, then that is 25 frames plus 7, which is my current faster cast speed, which is going to give me my total cast delay. So the faster my casting speed is, the better I'll be able to cast it, but the delay will always be there. It's never going to go away. Now, Molten Boulder has a lot of different aspects to it, and it's kind of a complicated ability. First off, as you can clearly see, it leaves a fire trail. So the fire trail that it leaves is a separate damage all on its own. So anything that stands in that fire is essentially taking something similar to what Firewall does on the Sorceress. Then on top of that, we also have a explosion when it actually hits the target, or when it ends. That explosion is a damage type all on its own. The explosion is the physical damage number that's written here, which is 1,536 to 1,696. So that is the physical damage. Then, after the explosion, a fire damage is actually put on the ground, which has the same exact shape as Meteor's fire damage. That fire damage is separate from the explosion. On top of this, we also have a on-hit damage, which is another effect of Molten Boulder. So when you actually use it on a target, it will actually hit the target physically as it passes the target by. So we've got multiple different damage types. And if we count them out, it's actually kind of crazy. We have a firewall, that's number 1. We have a on-hit, that's number 2. We have an explosion, that's number 3. We have a fire damage meteor effect that hits the ground, that's number 4. And then on top of that, it can hit a target multiple times as it travels because it can knock them back. So if you knock a target back, the Molten Boulder can hit them again for a second hit of physical damage, which basically makes it dish out 5 different damage hits, essentially, on a target. And if it knocks them back multiple times in a straight line, it can actually hit them more than 2 times, which is pretty crazy. However, there is something interesting to note about the knockback effect. So the knockback effect is actually going to knock the character away from where you are currently standing. But, as you can clearly see, the Molten Boulder takes a while to reach its final destination, which means that I could cast the ability and run here. Okay, now what does that mean? Well, if I cast the ability and then run on the other side of the Molten Boulder when it hits the target, it's going to knock them away from me in the opposite direction of the way the Molten Boulder is actually traveling. So you can actually control the direction that it knocks the target back by controlling the positioning of the Druid itself to make sure that you're standing where you want them to get knocked to. So if I cast it here, but I want them to go to the left, all I would have to do is cast it and then move my character to the left, and when they get hit, they will get knocked back to the left. Or similarly, if I wanted them to go to the right, I would move to the left and they would get knocked back to the right. I could also potentially have them knocked in this direction by simply moving on the other side of the Molten Boulder before it hit them. So cast it and literally run over here to this side, and then the monsters would get knocked this way instead, which is actually quite silly. So if you're trying to knock the monster back in a specific direction, remember that your position as a druid actually has a lot to do with how the particular skill will knock the monster back. So which direction the monster is going to get knocked is in direct correlation to where you're standing. On top of this, it's a very nice ability to utilize with at range, because it does have a very nice ranged effect. Obviously, you can hit targets from pretty far away with this. It has a nice little splash damage. You can knock targets back with it, which does make it fairly nice as a defensive ability as well. So as you can clearly see, I can utilize it to get monsters to move away from me. However, there is some notes about the knockback effect. So the knockback effect only works on size 1 and size 2 monsters. It will not work on size 3 monsters. This is important. So size 3 monsters are things like Urdars, Pit Lords, monsters that have, an exceedingly large bodice. Those monsters cannot be knocked back by Molten Boulder. Let me see if I can find some of those real quick. We do not have them here. Let's try Frigid Highlands. Sometimes there's some size 3 monsters here. There we go. So we've got some size 3 monsters on the list. And as you can see, no matter how hard I try, the Porous Thorn Hulks are not going to get knocked back by my Molten Boulder. So this is unfortunate when it comes to size 3 monsters, but they are not going to be affected by this particular ability. Now, there's a lot going on with the way that this ability works, and because of the way that fire damage applies to targets, it will actually dish out more damage specifically to larger monsters than smaller ones. So larger monsters tend to take more fire damage from Molten Boulder than the smaller ones. And in fact, there's a lot of strategy involved in utilizing the ability to get maximum damage output. And it involves basically the number of times that it can hit the monster, the knocking the monster back, whether or not they stay in a straight line. There's a lot that goes on with Molten Boulder, but it can actually dish out some pretty good damage. What can you do to maximize damage output with Molten Boulder? Well, the unfortunate thing is that because of the casting delay on Molten Boulder, there's really nothing you can do to make it like super duper amazing. What you're going to want to do with Molten Boulder is you're going to want to utilize other abilities with it. Because when it's on casting delay, you really can't do anything during that time period. So generally what you're going to do is you're going to do things like cast volcanoes in between, or you're going to cast fissure in between. So you're going to do things like fissure, Molten Boulder, fissure, Molten Boulder, fissure, Molten Boulder, and you're going to keep going back and forth like that. This will allow you to get maximum damage output by weaving in all of the other skills as well. Now, this is something that they changed back in the weaving patch. That's what I'm going to call it, the weaving patch. So it used to be there was a global cooldown across all skills. And so things like this 4-second volcano casting delay would cause, unfortunately, things like Molten Boulder to go on a really long cooldown. And they have completely removed that. So Fire Druid has actually become very interesting now, whereas before it was kind of a laughingstock because it was very difficult to actually build Fire Druid properly. Because if you wanted to use Volcano, well, guess what? Volcano would lock out all your other fire skills for the full duration of the casting delay, which was 4 seconds. Or if you wanted to utilize Fissure, which has a duration casting delay of 2 seconds, that would lock you out of all the other skills for 2 seconds. And so it was kind of a pain in the butt. But now you can actually weave in all of the skills together, so you can effectively use things like Fissure, Volcano, Molten Boulder, Firestorm, Fissure, Volcano, Molten Boulder, Firestorm, Fissure, Volcano, Molten Boulder, Firestorm, and you could weave them all together in a beautiful, like, cacophony of ridiculousness. And each one literally doing its own thing. Like, it's actually kind of silly because they all just kind of do their own thing, and that's really the truth of it. It's interesting because Volcano and Fissure really kind of pair well together because they're both abilities that can be cast on the target at a range. You don't have to actually be there. You don't actually have to do anything. Firestorm and Armageddon really kind of require you to be close up to the target. So if you're not close up to the target with those two abilities, you tend to be kind of not getting the optimal damage output because Armageddon is in a circle around you, and Firestorm is unfortunately just not a very long-range ability. Kind of requires you to really hump the leg of the target that you're fighting. Molten Boulder is the only one of the fire tree that kind of does its own thing, and it's not really either. It actually works surprisingly well with either of them because, number one, if you're using it at a close range, you're going to notice a pretty nice effect because you're going to get the nice little fire explosion at the end. It's going to dish out pretty decent damage to anything that's far away or close. And it tends to pair really well with just about any of them. The other two really kind of require you to be at a specific place. So if you're trying to utilize all the abilities, you end up being kind of like a melee character, where to get the optimal damage output of everything, you've got to be literally standing right on top of the monster so that you can dish out maximum damage effects. There's really not a whole lot more to be said about Molten Boulder, except for to exemplify the fact that it is indeed half physical damage. A lot of people will focus really heavily on the fire side of this tree. But the truth of the matter is that the majority of the damage of this tree is actually physical. So, like, with the exception of Firestorm, which requires you to hump the monster's leg to actually get good effective at it, the only other pure fire skill is Fissure. All of the rest of the abilities in the tree, Molten Boulder, Volcano, and Armageddon, all have a 50% physical damage component, which hits pretty hard. And if you ignore that physical component, you end up with a subpar character. I mean, it's kind of what I learned as I was building this character, is that I couldn't just focus on fire. I had to enhance the physical element of the attacks as well, and that's one of the reasons why my mercenary is using an amp damage polearm, because amplify damage increases the physical damage of Molten Boulder, the physical damage of Volcano, and the physical damage of Armageddon, giving me a pretty nice physical damage bump along with the fire damage, and helps me take care of pretty much any monster that's fire immune, or mostly fire immune, because obviously I get much less fire damage versus fire immune targets versus when they're not fire immune. When I first started, was utilizing Firestorm as my main ability. That was the one that I cast basically before everything, and I kind of fell out of love with it really quickly because it just doesn't really have the chutzpah to dish out the damage that I would like, and oftentimes I was way too weak to stand close enough to get the optimal effect from it. And I'm not saying that it doesn't dish out good damage, but it does require you to be very close, and this can often be an issue, especially if you're having trouble with survivability. Molten Boulder, on the other hand, which I think is the other option between the two, because it's the only other skill that you can put on your left click, by the way. Firestorm and Molten Boulder are the only two that function as left click abilities. Molten Boulder functions at a much greater range and offers a lot more flexibility in terms of positioning, whereas Firestorm just kind of, like, doesn't go as far, doesn't hit for as much damage. It's actually 1/3 of what it actually states, by the way. So if you actually take a look at Firestorm, it says 6,000 damage per second. It's actually 6,000 divided by 3, with each tine of the Firestorm dishing out 1/3 of the damage output. So it's not actually dishing out 6,000 per tine, it's dishing out 1/3 of that per tine. And all 3 tines have to hit the target for you to get the full damage output of the ability. To give you a kind of like an example, like I could cast this at these guys, and if it does happen to go underneath of them where all 3 tines hit the target, the damage output is actually quite decent. But it does require me to be a lot closer than I would like. Which is why I just generally like to spam Molten Boulder instead. Although, as I was talking about earlier, you kind of spam everything anyway. So it's really just a priority list. So like, what is your priority ability? What would you consider your second priority ability, and so forth and so on. And so what it ended up being for me specifically was my priority was Volcano. I wanted to make sure that Volcano was up all the time, and Fissure. Those were my two priorities. So Armageddon is something that you just cast and you forget. You don't even think about it. It lasts for 50 seconds, and you just cast it every now and then to refresh it. So basically what I would do is I would always cast Volcano first, then Fissure, and then I would rotate between Molten Boulder and Firestorm. And then eventually I would obviously recast Fissure and recast Volcano as those cooldowns became available. And it really makes for a very hectic and very ridiculous just menagerie of abilities, because once you have everything going, I mean, it's just tons and tons and tons of fire effects all over the screen. It's very messy. Like, it's a very messy character, in my opinion. It's also very loud, by the way. One of the things that I laughed about was I was like, man, this character is very loud. It's a very loud character. None of these abilities, by the way, can be used while in shapeshifted form, although there are some interesting ways that you can potentially get them in shapeshifted form. Firestorm has a very interesting use case scenario with the Phoenix rune word. You can get Phoenix rune words that actually have it as a proc chance, and it's actually not terrible. Molten Boulder also similarly is on the word destruction, and you can get some pretty decent proc chances with that. And there's also the 25% chance to cast Fissure on Earthshifter. So, like, if you did want to go with a kind of like a melee build, and as we were talking about earlier, Armageddon and Firestorm are really abilities that see their best use in melee. These tend to work better when it comes to those objects. However, Molten Boulder coming from Destruction is actually very interesting as well, and that one also spams volcanoes, by the way. I have a whole video on that if you want to take a look at my theory craft for the Destruction Werewolf. That was actually pretty fun. There's really not a lot more to go over when it comes to Molten Boulder. It's a great ability. You weave it in with your other abilities. It does have physical damage, have fire. It has a very nice knockback effect, which makes it very defensive. And overall, just one of the mainstays of this particular build. It works better with both sides of the tree, the more melee side of the tree and the more ranged side of the tree. It can be used with either one to great effect, which makes it a very nice in-betweener skill that you can definitely get good effect from. Anyway, as always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watching my videos, even when we're just yakking about Molten Boulder. As a funny little joke here, if you play Diablo 4, they took away the Molten, but they kept the Boulder. As always, thanks for watching. And keep watching.